Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Global Hint Season 1 and Episode 8. 10 days from now, President elect Joe Biden will take the office as the 46th President of the United States. As what can be described as a polarizing election, who occupies the White House could play a critical role in the foreign policy of a country. And today, we would be discussing the global ramifications of the US presidential elections. And it gives me immense pleasure in inviting Dhruva Jaishankar. He's the director of the US initiative at the Observers Researcher Foundation and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute. His research mainly focuses on India's role in international systems and with respect to India's politics, economy, and society, with particular focus on Indo-US, Indo-Pacific, and its relationship with Europe. And with me on the panel, I have Abhivardhan, who is the CEO and founder of Internationalism, Kartikeya Mishra, who is a lawyer and the member of the Global Legal Innovation Advisory at Internationalism, and me, I am Dakshayani Srinivasan, Program Coordinator at the India International Law Program at Internationalism. Sir, if you could just give us a brief introduction into the topic.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. This is, in some ways, a dramatic time to be. I'm based in Washington now, and as we saw just the events in the past few weeks with the storming of the U.S. Capitol, very dramatic images coming from there. The full fallout from that is still. We'll see in the next few days what happens, even before the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden. So it's a particularly, in some ways, troubling time internally for the U.S. It shows the full extent of the polarization. Even the aftermath of what happened at the Capitol has been interpreted very differently by different people based on what media they consume. So we still see a lot of conspiracy theories about who was behind it, sometimes without any real evidence. So it's a very polarizing time for the U.S. At the same time, I think I'm not as despondent as some of the very introspective. In some ways, the international reaction has been interesting. There's been a sort of sadness and introspection on the one hand. There's also been a slight sense of Schadenfreude, glee with sort of, oh, look, the U.S. had this coming, and all of that. They're no better than anybody else. By the way, I do think that that's true. The U.S. has problems that everybody else has problems. That everybody else has. But I'm not as certain that this is as defining a moment for the U.S. as it could have been, and perhaps that's for the better. And I'll get into that. I think we have become accustomed to these major shocks and people getting over them quite quickly. And some events that we thought were particularly dramatic even a year or two ago have been forgotten, partly because of the collective memory of the coronavirus and such. So what I'll try and do is, instead of focusing on the immediate events, is take a step back and look at some of the larger structural factors that the US is undergoing at this moment, and the implications for India and for others as well. I'll say, when Trump was elected 4 years ago in 2016, it was a big surprise to everybody. The polls overwhelmingly showed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Many people were actually underprepared including in Washington, by the way, were very underprepared for the implications of a Trump presidency. And I have to say, in hindsight, I think India was not as caught off guard as some of the others, in the sense that there was a bit of hedging against that possibility. The then Indian ambassador to US actually attended the Republican National Convention. Many Republicans actually stayed away from it when Trump was anointed the party candidate in 2016. There was an effort at engaging think tanks and other institutions that were seen as more pro-Trump. And India wasn't, frankly, in the crosshairs of Trump's criticism as much as other countries, Europe, Mexico, Japan, for a set of reasons that I will get into in just a minute. So, when Trump was elected, there was a sort of sense of shell shock around the world. India wasn't in as bad a predicament as many other countries, which were dependent upon the US to a great degree, either for trade or for military alliance or for both, in fact. And India did not have the same level of dependence. I think the other thing is sort of how India opted to engage with the Trump administration. And while there were clear points of difference, including on trade, on Russia, on Iran, certainly, that became points of friction. The idea was to actually try to minimize those points of friction or work towards resolving those points of friction, not always successfully. For example, there was not a trade agreement concluded, but maximize areas where there was commonality, including on the Indo-Pacific, including on, to some extent, on terrorism, including, on some, technology areas. So what ended up happening over the course of 4 years was a largely constructive relationship formed with a very difficult administration. Even and an attempt at least to minimize some of the differences. Now, some countries opted for a similar approach, Japan being one of them. UAE, Saudi Arabia tried to do a similar approach. Some of the European countries did, but others, Germany, for example, adopted a very different approach, which was, that this is not really worth engaging with because of who Trump is and so forth. So I think those were the choices that faced. Now, I think in hindsight, again, not to excuse the language or the rhetoric of Trump, but he in some ways raised questions during his campaign and during his term, which were, I would argue, good questions to raise and had good answers. And I'll focus on 6 quick areas where he did this. One, he asked the question, why should the US be paying for alliance, to subsidize an alliance with other countries when those countries are doing economically quite well and should be paying their fair share? So NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, were the major areas of focus where the US actually has troops. So he raised this question, and there is a good answer to that, which is in the long run that actually helps project US power. It actually, but it was not a question. The assumption was that NATO was sacrosanct. You do not question NATO, and that prevented, in my view, the foreign policy elite from actually explaining to a broader public, of which Trump was a reflection, as to what the benefits of that were. So that's one area where I think he raised questions, and certainly reset the terms of debate. A second was trade, which was the consensus since the early 1990s in the US was open trade, open markets would benefit the US. And while that did benefit US corporations, in fact, if you still look at the list of top corporations in the world, it's dominated by US companies, the very real question remained as to whether this actually benefited the middle class. So while mean incomes and mean wealth in the US increased, median income and median wealth remained roughly flat over the last quarter essentially. So growing inequality was a question. So I think he also raised this issue. Is free trade actually fair to the US? And again, there are good answers to that question, but not always sufficiently answered. A third area was open-ended military interventions, which is, the US successfully used military force in the Balkans in the 1990s, and less successfully in Iraq and Afghanistan after 2000. But there was this propensity because the US had the world's most powerful military, to use that as a tool to enforce political outcomes in places. And particularly as these wars continued, and some critics, I don't particularly like this terminology, but some critics call it forever wars. There was a question as to, if you don't have a plan for the next 2-3 years as to what you're going to resolve, does it make sense to keep an open-ended commitment to this country? Or does that create what's called a moral hazard? I mean, you're all lawyers, you would, which is that you would understand this, which is, does it actually excuse the governments of Iraq or Afghanistan from making the necessary adjustments for a post-US world? So he then decided to sort of pull out from these and withdraw troops, and it's been resisted by people in the Pentagon and the intelligence community here in the US. But again, it was a good question. What is the plan for these military interventions? Can the US afford to spend both lives and treasure, financially commit to these open-ended military interventions? 3 other areas more quickly. One is multilateralism. The US had established a set of international institutions, largely, not in all cases, but largely underwritten those institutions, been a leader at those institutions in setting the agenda, and knowing that they would sometimes constrain the US in its own actions. And again, he, in some cases, and I think the criticism does not apply evenly. In some cases, Trump was asking, why are we investing in these institutions when they constrain us and don't actually benefit? They've been captured by other interests, so don't actually serve the original purposes that they were set up to establish. And so you saw him withdraw from some of these institutions unilaterally. I think most contentious, perhaps, was the WHO and the climate treaty. There were ideological reasons, of course, as well, but there was a deep skepticism of multilateral institutions. Democratic cooperation was another one, which is there was a strong belief in the U.S. that other countries should, it would be better for the U.S. if other countries became more like the U.S., became liberal democracies. And he, in some ways, didn't really care about that. What other countries do is their business. It's not our business. And so you did see a drawdown in some ways of that. Although, on the other hand, he was very critical of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and the authoritarianism of that. But it did not necessarily lead to sort of a privileged treatment of democratic. So even, say, on China, India, Japan, other countries were subjected to similar trade. Tariffs applied in certain sectors. In the China case, it was significantly more. But the fact was there wasn't a clear differentiation between the friends and adversaries in those cases. And finally, I would say immigration policy. There's the sixth area where there was questions raised, which is, while there was an understanding that more liberal immigration policy by the US has benefited the US economy, in the sense that immigrants have created, including from India, for example, have created some of the most successful startups, creating jobs, are bringing talent to the country. That it was changing the demographic and cultural profile of the US. And there are many people, Trump seemed to sort of not have particularly as strong views about this, but some of his advisors clearly felt that the social and cultural costs of a lax immigration or liberal immigration policy outweighed the economic benefits of such a policy. So, and frankly, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of Americans felt exactly the same way. So I think these were questions that Trump raised. They were not all, they were all good questions, even though the consensus often offered good answers that were not always communicated or adequately expressed to a general public and to Trump himself. But that was where, these were all things that where there was a bipartisan consensus prior to Trump's election, where over the last 4 years that consensus has frayed, and questions are what will happen afterwards. So there's certainly open questions about whether the US today will commit to alliances, will commit to open-ended military interventions, will commit to democratic cooperation, to multilateral institutions, to free trade, and to a liberal immigration policy. These are today very much in question. So it brings me to my last point, which is you have an incoming Biden administration. He, over the last year or so, has his campaign has written things. He has given speeches. He has made appointments of key individuals. And so from a combination of those things, we can get some picture as to what their intention is with regard to these issues. And while many people say, listen, we'll just wind the clock back to pre-2016, Trump was an aberration, we'll just restore what was there before. The fact is that may not always be possible. And I would argue that in three of those 6 areas that I mentioned, they will successfully move back quite quickly because there is a strong consensus within the Democratic Party about restoring the status quo ante. And that is specifically on multilateralism. So they will rejoin institutions that Trump left unilaterally. So specifically, the WHO, Paris Climate Treaty, perhaps the Iran nuclear deal, being some of the UNESCO, being some of the things. A second area will be democratic cooperation. There's, partly because of the domestic climate here and this understanding that the US must improve democracy at home, there will be a strong emphasis on improving democracy around the world, cooperating with other democracies. So I think that will be back on the agenda to some extent. And liberal immigration policies will be another one, which even in the absence of large-scale immigration reform, what can be done under executive order by the White House on long-term visas, on short-term visas, and on refugees will be reversed. Some of what Trump did, and again, all these three issues find a popular resonance within the left of the Democratic Party. But in three other areas, I would argue that's not the case, where despite the best efforts of Biden and his administration, they may make at best some incremental changes because there will be resistance to the reversion to the status quo ante, not only from Trump and his supporters on the right, but also from pockets on the left as well. So on alliances, for example, there will be a continued emphasis, and the tone will be very different. It won't be as antagonistic, but to urge European allies and Japan and South Korea particularly to step up and to contribute more financially and in other ways to shared security challenges, which are basically the primary ones being for the US, Russia, and China, secondary ones being North Korea and Iran. So I think there will be a further emphasis on burden sharing in that sense. On trade, it'll be very difficult. Again, some adjustments. There won't be an obsessive focus on fixing trade deficits, but there will be. It'll be very difficult to get a major trade deal done with the U.S. in this particular climate because there's trade skepticism on both the right and left. And finally, military intervention. I think there's also a fatigue with large-scale military intervention in other countries and nation building in those countries using military force. And so it's not as if the U.S. military will totally come back to the home. It's obviously there still will be international deployments, but the focus will be on much more targeted operations rather than large-scale, Iraq-style or Afghanistan-style expeditions. The focus will also be on a geopolitical competition with these key adversaries that the U.S. has identified. So again, I think if we look back, some of this could change very much. The politics could change in the next few years. But if this all holds, then I suspect we will see Trump as having been a relatively an aberration for the U.S. on some key issues. That it was a bump in the road towards. It didn't change the trends. But on other key issues, he will have fundamentally changed the conversation, changed the trend lines in how the US behaves and interacts with the rest of the world. And final point before we get into discussion, I think we have to look at what the implications are for India. That's what I am most interested in personally. And I would say largely these trends are positive from India's point of view, with some caveats. So I think India would obviously appreciate a more multilaterally engaged US. In many ways, the US has been supportive of India in many institutions, including its further membership in institutions such as the Nuclear Suppliers Group or the UN Security Council, but has continued to work with the US in other forums as well. I think broadly there'll be alignment on democracy. I think there's some issues about how Indian approaches to democracy and particularly domestic developments in India, just as there are domestic developments in the US. But broadly, I would make the case that democracy is still more of a glue for India and the US than it is a point of contention. Immigration, obviously, India would appreciate a more relaxed immigration policy. It has been something that has brought the two countries together, has been mutually beneficial. On alliances, I think there is an understanding in India that the US cannot invest in old alliances, and that partnerships such as the one it has with India will help. I'd say the two areas which would be mixed will be on trade, where I think will still be contentious for some time, perhaps not as contentious under Trump. And I think on military interventions, again, the picture will be mixed, which is clearly India had its differences with the US intervention in Iraq, and particularly the feeling that it distracted the US from other challenges. But in Afghanistan, for example, clearly India was more satisfied with a large US military presence there, and the drawdown will have implications for Indian security. So I think that will be more of a mixed picture. But overall, I think if you look at all of this, I think I would be quite positive about the post-Biden administration and its ability to engage India from an Indian perspective. So I'll end on that note, and I look forward to the discussion with you.
I think it's muted.
You're audible.
No.
So,
Yeah. No, I'm unmuted. I think you're unmuted too.
it was quite enlightening what you briefed us. It was really enlightening. I have one question on multilateralism that you said that the Biden administration is likely to go back to the status quo ante, as we say, that what Trump has made it into a status quo. So if we compared that, like I kind of agreed with some kind of criticism Trump had due to the growing influence of China and the influence of international organizations. But like I thought that leaving those organization was not an alternative because it disrupted the multilateralism which we need. So do you think that Biden administration will go back to the same multilateralism, or they might create new avenues for likely minded liberal democracies to actually join in?
So I think the short answer is both. They will at least attempt both. I don't know how successful those efforts will be. It's hard to say at this point of time. I think some of the UN-led organizations, UN-led groupings, it's very easy for the US to go back into, and I think there's a strong belief that the US needs to be engaged in those entities, particularly to compete with China. So the WHO, UNESCO, the Paris Climate Treaty is technically also under UN. The one that might be a bit more difficult is the Iran nuclear deal, because that depends in large part on Iran as well, and whether Iran can be persuaded to go back to an agreement that the US unilaterally would withdrew from. So that I would put in a slightly different category. But the UN institutions I see the US re-engaging with. At the same time, I think there is an understanding that I think the US is not able to exert the same kind of sway within those institutions that it once did. That China has captured some of them by some critical institutions, by investing a lot of there, and by basically having key friends and allies in key places. So I think over time they will also explore alternatives as well, which is on certain issues. This will not be on everything. Looking at more new institutions that are more focused on like-minded cooperation. One area of particular interest to look out for will be in new technology norms. So some of this started under the Trump administration, but it'd be interesting to see. Some of this is locked into the U.S. engagement for legal and other reasons. But on artificial intelligence, on 5G, there's already some new institution building around, which only includes basically democratic countries, including India, by the way. So the UK has been pushing this D10 initiative, which is the Democratic 10, to work on 5G. AI has been, there is a institution that has just been set up at the OECD in Vienna, under their secretariat, to cooperate on artificial intelligence norms. Now, what exactly they do going forward, I don't know, and how much the US will emphasize these, but they are still in existence, and I suspect we'll see attempts at trying to create similar institutions.
The other question I had was regarding the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's highly likely that Biden administration will rejoin the agreement, and so if a US enters that initiative, I think there might be more goals and more pressure on other countries in order to achieve those goals. So I think it might be hard for India, as we are recovering from a pandemic and our economy is still on track to revival. So if there will be an increase on environmental goals, it will be more pressure on the Indian economy. So how do you see this happening? Or
so I'm actually not worried about that. Not really worried about that at all. And basically because, for better or for worse, the Paris Climate Treaty is the baseline from which everyone is operating. And the only major economy that is actually meeting its Paris commitments as of now is India. If you look at there's there's a climate tracker that follows this, and the reason for this, frankly, is that India actually, got away at the time with relatively modest commitments that they had to make. Partly, because India was at the time a much lower per capita emitter. But India is currently on track to meet its Paris climate goal, which cannot be said about any other major economy. The UK comes close, I think, but none of the other European economies, or China, or Japan, or certainly the US come close to meeting those. So if it is just about meeting Paris, which the US will struggle to do, by the way, I don't see India being put under any added expectation for India. The point I make here to U.S. interlocutors is, the U.S. is still talking about a Green New Deal. India is actually doing a Green New Deal in some ways. If you look at the scale of the particular ramping up of renewables and things like that. So I don't anticipate that being a problem. The only thing that may happen, and I doubt this will happen, but it is a possibility, is if the U.S. says, look, we really need to push for a Paris Plus. There is something beyond Paris. And in that process, and another caveat, in that process, if they decide to do away with the basis of differential responsibility, right, which was the basis for the UN negotiations on climate until the Paris Treaty, which was those who had historically emitted less have less of a responsibility to curb their emissions. Those who historically, so it created a distinction between the developed and the developing economies broadly. If they decide to scrap that for whatever reason in any post-Paris agreement, then that opens up a huge can of worms. And I doubt they do that, partly because the US will have trouble meeting its own obligations, partly. Partly China and India are already rushing ahead with plans for investing in renewables and alternative. So I'm not too worried about that at this point of time. I think the kind of differences that were apparent at the Copenhagen Climate Summit pre-Paris will not enough time has passed and enough changes have been made that we're not really going to revert to that.
Okay. So Dakshani, do you have other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Karthikeya, and thank you, sir. That was really enlightening. So one aspect that I'm really interested on is the 3 points that you mentioned on trade, fight against terrorism, and this image about US being a mediator in major disputes. So I would like to touch upon these 3 issues and probably pick on a particular relationship between 2 countries. For example, US and Africa. There is a general narrative that goes on that the US-Africa relationship needs to be boosted, and especially with respect to Obama, Trump, and now in the future Biden. With respect to the trade, how do you think? Do you think that there needs to be a change in the tactics that they use in diplomacy, which takes as Africa as a space for competition? A competition space with China rather than a space as such. Do you think will there be a change in the Biden administration?
It's hard to say, and it's one of those things that everybody talks about. The U.S. Africa, just because the demographic profile of Africa is very positive, that the scope for economic growth is immense. The U.S. needs to be engaged there. China has been making much greater inroads in Africa. Now, for all the talk and the recognition of that, I think a few there's some important challenges as to why this hasn't materialized as much as it should. One is basically the US does not do conventional manufacturing to the same degree as it once did, and China does. It's a simple fact. The nature of the 2 economies is very different today. The US is today a services-driven economy, and most major manufacturing, with some exceptions, of course, has really gone offshore to China, Mexico, to other places. So if you look at the trade agreement, if you look at the content of trade between China and Africa, it is largely resources and raw materials from Africa going to China. and it is manufactured goods going from China to Africa. I mean, I'm simplifying it significantly, but if you look at the sum and substance of that relationship, that's what it is, right? So it's Chinese investment going in, going out. Now, again, there are a lot of exceptions to this. Chinese telecom is in Africa in a big way and stuff like that. But this is the so the U.S. the nature of the U.S. economy will make it difficult for the U.S. to compete in those areas, in those terms. There are other areas where the U.S. can play to its strengths, where now the problem is in some of those areas, say, for example, high-end services, there isn't yet a large enough market in Africa. So, you don't have Apple, because Apple appeals to a very high-end, high-value market. Apple's big markets are Europe, East Asia, even India. They're not a major market there. They only appeal to a small elite. So Africa, it's even, it's small. So basically, American companies are not as interested in Africa as they arguably should be from a geopolitical and from other reasons. So that's made it a bit more difficult. A further difference is the U.S. government doesn't have the ability to channel funding in a large way, in a major way, overseas. They have large aid projects, which are still quite significant, administered through the US AID, but doesn't have the ability to, either the tie-ups with state-owned enterprises, which China has, or other ability to sort of pool funding to invest very heavily in markets that are not either sure bets, that are very safe markets, or high return markets, right? And the problem, this doesn't even apply to Africa. This applies to even South Asia as well, which is it's not yet apparent to many of these institutional funders that if you want to reap long-term profits, you have to actually sink a lot of investment up hand, right? So you, again, I'm just making this up, but you have to incur losses for 10 years, and then you've captured the market, and then you will have major profits from then on. No major U.S. private sector entity is willing to incur that long-term cost, because they're responsible to their shareholders, who will look at quarterly returns and why are you sinking so much money into Africa. Now, some are starting to do this in India. Amazon is doing this in India to some degree. They can afford to do that, but it's again, given that the African market is itself very dispersed. You don't have a single major player. Even in Nigeria or Ethiopia is still relatively small compared to, say, in India. There's a lot of risk averseness in the U.S. private sector. So all of this is to say, and actually one final point on that, which is the U.S. will also have to look at picking and choosing its battles in some ways, right? Which is, it can't be everywhere. It's no longer the 1990s. It can't be everywhere equally at the same time. And I think going forward, there's an increasing view that there are basically three theaters which are priorities for the US, at least from a geopolitical point of view, which are Europe, Middle East, and Asia, right? And unfortunately, for these reasons, Africa and Latin America get somewhat overlooked in a lot of these conflicts. Again, from a geopolitical, I'm not saying from an economic perspective. So for all of these reasons, I'm just identifying what are some of the major obstacles for why, for all the talk of the US wanting to be a bigger player in Africa, competing with China and stuff like that, that will be very difficult in practice. And I think more realistically, what will happen is you will have, African economies picking up. You will see some minor backlash towards China, but you'll also see many countries gravitate more towards China which they see as a more natural partner than the US. But I don't, I'm not sure, even though there's an opportunity there, I'm not sure the US is, for all of these reasons, economic, political, security related, is not really in a position to seize that opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And there's this one last question that I have. It's about the fight against terrorism that is prevalent in very much in different corners of the world. So, given the situation in Sahel and Mali and the Lake Chad Basin, do you think there would be a trend towards a counter-terrorism plus policy where such policies are much more rigorous? compared from the Trump administration to the Biden, considering that there are some positive results from the Trump administration's policies?
So, I mean, let me start off by saying, like, Africa is not something I follow as carefully as other areas. But I'd say a couple of things on that. One is, in certain areas, the US is just not playing as big a role as it was, even after 9/11, where, I think if you had a sort of Boko Haram type situation in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, you would have seen a much more robust US engagement there. Today, in some ways, particularly in West Africa, the French seem to be playing a much bigger role in Mali, in Niger, and places like Chad, which they see as the French see as their traditional realm of influence, and it's mostly special operations and intelligence support. But there is a French military presence in West Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, at least, the US seems to be concentrating its focus more on the east. So you still have operations in Somalia, for example. Targeted operations, and that's likely to continue. And in fact, I think what we see continued in Somalia, which gets almost no attention in the US because the US footprint is very small, it may be similar to what we'll see in places like Iraq and Afghanistan going forward, which is, it's not, when people say, well, the US pull out of Afghanistan, we may see a very small presence where the US is still conducting some special operations, is providing intelligence support, is actively engaged there, but with a very small human and financial footprint. So Somalia may be that model that going forward. So anyway, let's see. But I think, again, to some extent, the passage of time after 9/11 has made some of that a little less secure. I think there's also growing skepticism of this view that, and this was a very strong view for a while, that economic development would prevent terrorism. In fact, I think there's almost no academic literature that supports that correlation between development and a reduction in terrorist violence. So even using economic tools, I think, there's a greater deal of skepticism that say, if you just throw a lot of aid at X country, that the terrorism problem will be solved. So no, I think it's just going to be about managing those problems, and the US will be focusing more on what it sees as the major challenges. In fact, actually, this coming week, I am recording, it'll be public, a conversation with the former US Deputy National Security Advisor, who was the primary author of the National Security Strategy in 2017. And I mean, a good question will be, when the incoming administration, how much of that will they continue? Because that's quite a clear document and lists what the threats are for the US, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, basically, North Korea, Iran, in that order, are seen as the major challenges, the geopolitical challenges from a US perspective. So, how much of that sentiment will continue in a Biden administration will remain to be seen.
Yes, thank you so much for it was really enlightening. Abhivarzan, could you take it ahead?
Sure. Pardon for my network issues. I had just some bumps, so now it's fine. So I would be focusing my questions on the transatlantic partnership, basically, which the Americans have with the Europeans, and a little bit on the Quad. So I'll start with the quadrilateral itself. Now, we know that the quadrilateral has at least started becoming, I would say, top of the town because of the military exercises, I would say, the maritime exercises as we had in the past months. Most of the time, not we generally, I would say scholars and people have discussed that it was more of a Trumpian vision to start, or I would say restart Quad. And more or less, they focus on the jaggery, whether Biden recognizes Indo-Pacific or not. That is obviously a question. So in general, and I'm taking the perspective of ASEAN, for the sake of ASEAN in India, since we know that once the four countries' leaders met recently, they were very clear on the fact that they want an ASEAN-centric Quad. That's something which was already very clear. So considering that perspective, how do we see how do we see some alignment or some reasonability when it comes to the development of Quad? We are not saying that I don't believe that Quad will become a multilateral body so soon, but I would rather argue in a question, I would say that maybe there could be a chance that some political alignment, some economic alignment might be possible. So how would the US see it as per the limitations and so on?
Right. So there was a lot inherent in your question. I think let me try and unpack that a little bit. So I think the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific that the US articulated was driven basically by the rise of China. It's driven by the reality that China is today a major economic and security actor in the Western Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, and that it is only becoming more so. That it now has a military base in the Indian Ocean. It is playing a more active permanent security role there. It is through the Belt and Road Initiative using its economic leverage for political gain in this broader region. So the Indo-Pacific is a simple reflection of that reality. Southeast Asia is at the hub of that, and if you look at a map, it's at the center of that. But so is Northeast Asia, so is the Indian Ocean, South Asia, and the Indian Ocean broadly. So that's the Indo-Pacific part. I think the other thing implicit in that is that with China's rise, it is becoming less free and less open, right? So hence the need to ascertain that it must remain free and open. So the open part particularly reflects the South China Sea issue, which China is attempting to, and has militarized and has, the fear is that it will make it an exclusive Chinese zone. So that is that reflection. Now, when you look around the broader Indo-Pacific and say, okay, who shares that worldview that I briefly articulated here? The fact is not many countries do share the US's worldview there. Japan does, Australia does, and India does, right? Other countries believe that, no, we can find some way to work this out. And what's the big deal? Maybe we shouldn't challenge China on the South China Sea. Maybe we shouldn't challenge the Belt and Road Initiative. It's all, why is Chinese investment different from Japanese investment or Indian investment or anything like that? So that is the broad view, at least publicly, of most countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And the few who are, again, not on every issue, but on most issues, in agreement with the view that this is a challenge to their interests, but also for mutual collective interests, are really these four. So the Quad became, in some ways, a self-selected. It reflects the few countries that broadly agree with this worldview. Now, once there was that understanding, it was about getting those four countries together to say, listen, where do we agree? Where do we disagree? What can we do about it? And that started at a working level in 2017, in November 2017, when the first renewed Quad meetings took place at a pretty junior level, at what in India is a joint secretary, at an assistant secretary level. And over that, it become regular. I mean, they now meet at least two, three times a year at that level. And now it's been upgraded to a foreign ministers meeting as well. But as of now, it is still about working on these issues. Where can we find agreement? Where can we coordinate? Where, that. Parallel to that, there's the issue of military exercises. And there the question was, if you are going to institutionalize military exercises, you shouldn't have a situation where one country decides for their own purposes with China or for anybody else to withdraw. And so it took a period of time before the India-Australia relationship in particular, and by the way, bilateral exercises over the last few years have really increased a lot, including naval from 2015 onwards. It took a while before the level of trust could be established. Before it was, with the new government in Australia after 2019, it was basically understood, okay, we're at a stage where we can return to the Quad, and no one's actually going to break from that group and unilaterally pull out. It's unlikely to happen. So now we've had the return of quadrilateral military exercises, but the bigger story is that the relationship amongst the Quad countries has intensified. So between Japan and India, between Australia and Japan, between India and the US, between all those four countries. Now, the other thing to emphasize, I think, and this is where, is that it's not I don't think any of the four countries want to project this as an exclusive grouping, right? Because they want it to be, the objective is still to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. Again, the new administration in the US may use a different terminology. But broadly speaking, that is the understanding. And the question is really about how can you maximize other relationships as well, in the sense that those countries are comfortable with it. Now, where the challenge comes in is that it was almost impossible for all 10 ASEAN countries to agree on anything. And so for all the talk about we need to engage with ASEAN, the fact is that on any proposal, it was impossible to get all 10 ASEAN countries to sign on to anything that any of the four Quad countries individually were willing to propose. So I think in the future, we'll see some selective engagement with some of those countries, with South Korea, with New Zealand, with the UK and France on some issues, particularly security issues, with some of the South Asian countries, with some of the East African countries. So I think what they will keep on reiterating is this is not an exclusive grouping. We're not trying to be a club where we are selective because we just happen to be the four countries that are willing, that share a view on this subject. And I think that understanding has permeated the US bureaucracy. I think they understand that. Sometimes I think the scholarly community gets a bit ahead of itself, starts talking about, should the Quad establish a secretariat, and many be much more ambitious. But this is the base understanding of what's happening and what it's trying to achieve. So I mean, I would look at, say, some efforts to engage Indonesia, for example, on maritime domain awareness, bringing in France, and we'll see more such activity. We'll see some, India, Thailand, Singapore trilateral exercises that took place in the Straits of Malacca. So I think attempts will be made to engage ASEAN members on issues that they feel comfortable engaging with and where they broadly share the views of these countries. But I think it'll be very difficult to get a sense of consensus amongst the 10 ASEAN countries. And that is something that we'll see with the incoming US administration as to how quickly they achieve this realization that it's not just about continue working with ASEAN whenever possible. But if you put all your eggs in that basket, you're not going to get too far. That it will require working with other partners. And the Quad is one, perhaps the most important configuration of countries that to advance those objectives.
I certainly agree with that. Well, getting on transatlantic partnership now, which is my second pointer, we have seen that under the last administration, I would say the Trump administration, very frankly, we have seen that the EU and NATO have been, wherever necessary, there have been no case of consensus or agreement and so forth. The EU and NATO have been facing some tremors, basic issues on which country is funding the most, or how the agenda of rule of law and democracy is to be understood. Because again, as I remember, I think so that the Trump administration has tried investing in certain key Eastern European and Central European countries like Poland and so on. Now, I certainly believe that since we are seeing that multilateralism will be revisited, obviously in a realist sense, which should be done, maybe the case that NATO and EU, when it comes to its relation with US, will have maybe a little better stage. So I am taking more into the perspective of the Central Asian region, I would say, from side of Turkey to, I would say, Russia. Because one thing which we have seen is that when the elections were going on, we had the turbulent conditions in the region near Armenia and so on. And the action by EU was somewhere down the line under critical appreciation, as it would be. So now, considering this, how would we see I would say, the blossoming of the partnership when it comes to strategic circles in Eastern Europe and Central Asia? How would it go on? Because that's something which I think so during this administration was more of related to the unilateral perspectives. But let's see. I would really like to know what do you think of it?
Yeah, so I would draw a distinction here between NATO and the European Union, even though most of the member states, there's a lot of overlap between the two institutions, members, states. So NATO was started as essentially an anti-Soviet bloc, right? It was an anti-Soviet military bloc. And post the dissolution of the Soviet Union, post 1991, there were questions as to what was its relevance going forward, what was its objectives. You had NATO employed in Afghanistan as a sort of expeditionary force. or a role that has now broadly been wound down. But I think the question remains as to what purpose it fulfills. There, I think that there'll be two issues going forward. And by the way, the US is a member of NATO, unlike the European Union, right? The US has is the leader. In fact, the Supreme Commander is always an American. So one issue is really about the burden sharing aspect of it, which is the financial and troop commitments of the various countries. And there, a lot of the focus has been on Germany in particular, which is the largest economy in Europe, is still doing very well, and whether it is willing and able to play a sufficient security role within NATO. At the same time, the French in particular have been pushing for a more autonomous security policy, and leading the talk about strategic autonomy. But that gets into lots of questions where the French and Germans, and now the Brits having pulled out of the European Union, how does that work? So a lot of questions there. One issue is on the burden sharing issue, which will continue to be an irritant or a question mark at least. The second is really there's a problem with Turkey specifically, which is Turkey is a NATO member. It has been a NATO member for a long time, but it's now pursuing a very independent security policy that is often putting it in direct odds with other NATO members, including Greece, which is its neighbor, to the point where the French have sent warships into the Eastern Mediterranean against a fellow NATO ally. And particularly as we saw in the Nagorno-Karabakh violence, Armenia-Azerbaijan violence, Turkey is pursuing a very autonomous policy there. Also in Libya, where Italy and Turkey are sometimes at odds with each other, in Syria and elsewhere. So I think there is going to also be a longer structural question about Turkish membership in NATO, and that will complicate the future of that entity. The second issue is with the European Union, and there I would draw a great distinction because the EU came together as an economic and social bloc in some ways, almost as a competitor to the US. I mean, in fact, in the 1990s, people thought that the future competition was going to be between the US and European Union, not between the US and China. And so there's often been a very strong independent streak there, and there Germany has a lot more levers than it does in NATO. Germany calls the shots, and we saw to a great degree, and to a lesser extent France, and we saw that recently with the EU-China investment agreement that was finalized at the end of last year, at the end of 2020, which was done despite a statement from the incoming Biden administration, specifically the National Security Advisor, to essentially hold off and continue talks. Let's talk about this first before you finalize something. That's essentially what he was communicating, and the European Union went ahead with it anyway. And that it was really led by Germany. It was really a show of German clout within the structure of the European Union. So I think that doesn't necessarily herald this the Biden administration coming in saying, look, we'll restore ties with the Europeans, which have been understandably frayed in the last few years. But when the European Union does something like this, I think it will raise some question marks in Washington, including with the new administration that is favorably disposed towards Europe, as to how much we can really, from their point of view, how much can we really invest in this partnership going forward? Do we really stand together on an important issue such as China? So anyway, all of this is to say that I think transatlantic relations will be quite fraught for the near future, even though there will be like-mindedness that will continue between the two.
Dakshani, you can go ahead. Yeah.
I'm afraid I will have to jump off in just a minute or two. So
yes,
sorry
I think yes, no problem. I think we are out of the questions ourselves. I believe we are bereft of all the questions, but I think we can then conclude. So Dakshani, if you wish, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. That was a really illuminating discussion on the global ramifications. As we said, we would definitely look upon these 6 points that you mentioned on immigration policies, the subsidies to NATO, trade, military interventions, multilateralism, and democracy cooperation, and we really look forward to looking towards the trends as well. And thank you so much, sir. It was really happy having you on board.
Thank you so much for having me.